The sun was barely up when James woke that morning. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just like every weekday for the past 15 years. He rubbed his eyes and took a deep breath before stepping out of bed, careful not to wake his wife, who was still fast asleep beside him. The wooden floor creaked under his feet as he made his way to the bathroom. After a quick shower, James put on his work clothes, a navy blue polo shirt with his company logo and khaki work pants. He looked at himself in the mirror, straightening his collar. At 34, his face showed the early signs of a hard-working life, tiny wrinkles around his eyes from squinting at electrical wires, and strong, calloused hands from years of manual labor. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee and started making breakfast for his kids. The smell of pancakes soon filled the small house. His 2 children, aged 7 and 10, stumbled into the kitchen still half asleep. The younger one climbed onto a chair, eyes still droopy. "Morning, Dad," the older one mumbled, reaching for the orange juice. "Got a big day today?" his wife asked, appearing in the doorway tying her robe. She worked evening shifts at the hospital, so mornings were their time to catch up. "Just a regular job at that store on Pine Street," James answered, flipping a pancake. "Should be done by 3, then I can pick up the kids from after school." He had built his electrical business from scratch after learning the trade from his uncle. It wasn't fancy work, but it paid the bills and allowed him some flexibility to be there for his family. Breakfast was quick but full of the usual morning chaos, spilled milk, homework questions, and reminders about the day ahead. James packed lunchboxes while his wife helped their youngest tie his shoes. These ordinary moments felt precious to him, the simple routine of family life that he had worked so hard to build. By 7:15, he kissed everyone goodbye and headed to his van. The vehicle wasn't new. A white 2009 model with some rust spots and his business name painted on the side, but it was reliable and carried all the tools and equipment he needed. The radio played softly as he drove through his neighborhood, nodding at familiar faces also starting their day. The job site was about 30 minutes away in a nicer part of town. James had been hired to fix some electrical issues at a small clothing store. The owner had called him after getting his name from another satisfied customer. That's how James got most of his business, word of mouth from people who appreciated his fair prices and quality work. He pulled into the nearly empty parking lot at 8 a.m. sharp. The store wouldn't open until 10, giving him plenty of time to work without customers around. The owner greeted him with a handshake and a cup of coffee, then showed him the problem: some lights that kept flickering and a couple of outlets that weren't working. "No problem, I'll have it fixed before you open," James assured him with confidence. This was the kind of straightforward job he could do with his eyes closed. He unloaded his tools and got to work, methodically checking the wiring and replacing what needed fixing. The morning passed peacefully. James worked while humming along to the radio, stopping only to drink water or answer a text from his wife. By noon, he had fixed the main issues and was just doing some final checks. The store owner was pleased, already noticing the improvement in the lighting. "You do good work," the owner commented, writing out a check for the agreed amount. James smiled, feeling that small sense of pride that came with a job well done. "Just doing what I love," he replied honestly. It was true. Despite the early mornings and occasional difficult clients, he genuinely enjoyed solving problems and working with his hands. He started packing up his equipment, mentally planning the rest of his day, picking up supplies for tomorrow's job, getting the kids, maybe grilling something for dinner if the weather held up. Just another ordinary day in a life he had carefully built. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. James whistled as he carried the last of his tools back to the van. The job had gone smoothly, just the kind of straightforward electrical work he enjoyed. The store owner had already paid him and gone back inside to prepare for opening. The parking lot was still mostly empty, with only a few cars belonging to employees of the surrounding businesses. He had just placed his toolbox in the back of the van when he heard the sound of engines. Looking up, James saw 2 police cruisers turning sharply into the parking lot, tires screeching slightly against the asphalt. Something about the way they drove in, fast and purposeful, made his stomach tighten. At first, he thought they were heading somewhere else, responding to some emergency nearby. But both cars stopped right behind his van, blocking it in. 3 officers got out quickly, their hands hovering near their weapons. "What's going on?" James asked, genuinely confused. He stood very still, suddenly aware of how alone he was in this nearly empty lot. "Don't move," the tallest officer ordered, his voice sharp. "Keep your hands where we can see them." James raised his hands slowly, a chill running down his spine despite the warm spring day. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "ID. Now," demanded another officer, a stocky man with sunglasses that hid his eyes. "My wallet's in my back pocket," James said carefully. "I'm going to reach for it, okay?" The officers tensed, and one put his hand directly on his holster. "Slowly," he warned. With deliberately careful movements, James retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license. "I'm just an electrician," he explained, gesturing toward his van with its company logo. "I was fixing the lights at this store. You can ask the owner. He's inside." The officers ignored his explanation. The one with the sunglasses looked at his license and then at him, as if suspecting the ID might be fake. "What are you doing in this area?" the officer asked, his tone suggesting that James had no legitimate reason to be there. "Like I said, I'm an electrician. I was hired to fix the electrical problems in that store." James pointed again toward the building. "I've got the work order in my van if you need to see it." "How long have you been here?" the third officer asked, circling around to look inside his van without permission. "Since 8 this morning," James replied, feeling increasingly uneasy. "About 4 hours now." "What is this about? Have I done something wrong?" Instead of answering, the tall officer spoke into his radio, giving James's name and date of birth, checking for warrants. James stood in the hot sun, hands still partially raised, aware of people in nearby businesses beginning to notice the scene. "Sir," James tried again, his throat dry. "I don't understand what's happening. Could you please tell me why you're questioning me?" "There was an incident reported in this area," the officer with sunglasses finally said, though he offered no specifics. "You match a description we received." James took a deep breath. "What description?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. The officers exchanged glances but didn't elaborate. The one who had been looking through his van now approached. "What's in the toolboxes?" he demanded. "Tools. I'm an electrician," James repeated, fighting to keep frustration from his voice. "Wire cutters, pliers, voltage testers, work tools." At that moment, the store owner stepped outside, looking confused at the police presence. "Is everything okay out here?" he called. James felt a flash of relief. "Sir, can you please tell these officers that I was working for you today?" But before the owner could get close enough, the tall officer stepped between them. "Sir, please stay back. This is police business." "But that's my electrician," the owner protested, looking increasingly concerned. "We'll need you to come with us," the officer with sunglasses said to James, ignoring the owner's comment. "Am I under arrest?" James asked, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "What's the charge?" Instead of answering, the tall officer reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." A cold feeling washed over James as the officer's words sank in. The parking lot seemed to freeze around him as the officer pulled his arms behind his back. The handcuffs clicked shut, biting into his wrists. "This is a mistake," James said, his voice tight. "I haven't done anything. I was just working." The store owner stepped forward again, looking distressed. "Officers, there must be some misunderstanding. This man has been working in my store all morning. I hired him." "Sir, please step back," the tall officer repeated firmly. "We're conducting an investigation." "At least tell me what I'm being arrested for," James insisted, trying to maintain his composure despite the panic rising in his chest. His thoughts raced to his family. He was supposed to pick up his kids later. What would happen if he didn't show up? "You fit the description of a suspect in a break-in that occurred nearby," the officer with sunglasses finally explained, though his tone suggested he was doing James a favor by sharing even this vague information. "A break-in? What description?" James asked. "I've been working here all morning. There are security cameras inside the store that can prove it." The officers ignored his protest. The tall one took his arm and began guiding him toward the police car. James could feel eyes on him from people in nearby businesses who had stopped to watch. The shame of being handcuffed in public burned through him, even though he knew he'd done nothing wrong. "My tools and equipment," James said, looking back at his van. "Everything I need for work is in there. I can't just leave it." "We'll take care of it," one officer said dismissively, though no move was made to secure the van. "Please," James said to the store owner as he was led away. "Can you watch my van? Call my wife. Her number's on the work order on the front seat." The owner nodded, looking helpless as the officers put James in the back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut with a finality that made James's stomach drop. Through the window, he could see the owner arguing with one of the officers, pointing toward the store as if offering to show proof of James's legitimate business there. Inside the police car, everything felt unreal. The hard plastic seat, the mesh barrier between the front and back, the inability to open the doors from the inside. All of it drove home that this wasn't just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in minutes. He was actually being arrested. As the car pulled away, James watched his van growing smaller in the distance, containing thousands of dollars of equipment he'd spent years accumulating. He thought of the jobs he had scheduled for tomorrow and the next day, clients who would be waiting for him to show up. His reputation, built carefully over 15 years, could be damaged by this one incident. The drive to the police station seemed both endless and too quick. James tried to stay calm by breathing deeply, but questions kept spinning in his mind. What exactly was he suspected of? Why wouldn't they listen when the store owner tried to vouch for him? How long would this take to clear up? When they arrived at the station, the officers led him through a side entrance, away from the public lobby. The building was cold and smelled of industrial cleaner. They took him to a processing area where his personal belongings were collected: his wallet, phone, keys, watch, even his wedding ring. Each item disappeared into a plastic bag, leaving him feeling increasingly stripped of his identity. "I need to make a phone call," James said as they took his fingerprints. "My wife won't know where I am. My kids." "You'll get your phone call," an officer said flatly. After processing, they took his photo, standing him against a wall with a height chart behind him. The camera flash felt like a punctuation mark on his humiliation. In that moment, it hit him fully. He was being treated like a criminal, with no evidence, no warrant, no real explanation. Just because, as the officer had put it, he fit a description. After the processing was complete, instead of getting his promised phone call, James was led to a holding cell. The heavy door clanged shut behind him, and he stood there, still struggling to believe this was really happening to him. The holding cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner with no privacy screen. The walls were covered in scratches and faded graffiti, silent testimonies from others who had sat where James now sat. He lowered himself onto the cold metal bench, his handcuffs finally removed, but the feeling of them still lingering on his wrists. Time seemed to move differently in this small space. Without his watch or phone, James could only guess how long he'd been there. An hour? 2? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, never changing, giving no hint about whether it was day or night outside. His thoughts kept returning to his family. His wife would be expecting him to pick up the kids from school. When he didn't show up, she would call his phone, which was now sitting in a plastic bag somewhere in the building. Would the store owner have managed to contact her? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Occasionally, he heard footsteps passing by his cell, but no one stopped to speak to him. Each time someone walked past, James stood up, hoping for information, only to watch them continue down the hallway without a glance his way. "Excuse me," he called out when an officer finally passed close enough. "I need to make my phone call. My family doesn't know where I am." The officer barely slowed down. "Someone will be with you when they can," he said without looking at James. "Can you at least tell me what I'm being charged with?" James asked, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. "You're being held pending investigation," was the only reply he got before the officer disappeared around a corner. James sat back down, running his hands over his face. The vagueness of pending investigation told him nothing. In the quiet of the cell, his mind filled with worst-case scenarios. What if they actually charged him with something? He'd never been arrested before. He had no record, had never even had a speeding ticket. Would that matter? Or would they see him as just another suspect? From somewhere down the hall, he could hear fragments of conversation between officers. He strained to listen, hoping to catch something about his case. Description was so general. One voice said, "Just a black male, 30s in the area," another replied. James felt a surge of anger. That was it? That was the description he supposedly matched? A black man in his 30s? That could be thousands of people in the city. More time passed. James paced the small cell, then sat, then paced again. His stomach growled. He'd missed lunch, and by now probably dinner too. A paper cup of water sat on the bench, left by someone earlier, but no one had mentioned food. Finally, the door at the end of the hall opened, and a different officer approached his cell. "You get a phone call," the officer said, unlocking the door. James followed him to a wall-mounted phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed his home number, praying his wife would answer. "Hello." Her voice was tight with worry. "It's me," he said, relief washing through him just at the sound of her voice. "James, where are you?" "I've been calling and calling." "I'm at the police station," he cut in, aware that the officer was standing just a few feet away listening. "They picked me up at the job site. Some kind of mistake." There was a moment of shocked silence. "The police? What happened?" "They think I was involved in some break-in, but I was working all morning. The store owner saw me there." He spoke quickly, unsure how long he had for this call. "Did he call you about my van?" "Yes, about 2 hours ago." He sounded really upset about what happened. Her voice hardened. "This isn't right, James. What are they charging you with?" "Nothing yet. They're investigating." "Look, I don't know how long I'll be here." "Are the kids okay?" "They're worried. We all are." He could hear the strain in her voice, trying to stay strong. "I called Mike from church. He's a lawyer, remember? He's on his way to the station now." The officer tapped his watch. "Time's up." "I have to go," James said quickly. "Tell the kids I'll be home as soon as I can. I love you." "Sir, wrap it up," the officer insisted. "I love you too. We'll get this straightened out," his wife promised. The line went dead, and James was led back to his cell. The door clanged shut behind him again, but somehow he felt less alone now. His family knew where he was. Help was on the way. He sat on the bench and waited, clinging to that small comfort in the sterile, unchanging cell. Lisa paced the living room floor, her cell phone clutched tightly in her hand. Every few minutes, she checked the screen for missed calls, though she knew she wouldn't have missed the ring. The kids sat at the kitchen table, homework open but untouched, watching her with worried eyes. "Is Dad in trouble?" their 10-year-old asked, his voice small. "No, honey," Lisa assured him, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's been a mix-up, that's all. Dad was at work, and the police made a mistake." But why did they take him if he didn't do anything wrong? Their 7-year-old's bottom lip trembled. Lisa sat down between them, putting an arm around each child. "Sometimes adults make mistakes too, even police officers. But we're going to fix it. Mr. Mike is going to help us." The doorbell rang, and Lisa jumped up. It was Mrs. Thompson from next door, bringing a casserole. "I saw you missed pickup at school," she explained. "Thought you might need a hand with dinner." Word was spreading through their small community. By evening, Lisa's phone was buzzing constantly with messages from friends, church members, and James's clients. The store owner had called twice more, offering to go to the police station himself to explain again that James had been working for him all morning. "I told those officers," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "I even offered to show them the security footage from the store. They wouldn't listen." As the night wore on, more people began showing up at the house. Pastor Williams arrived with his wife, bringing coffee and moral support. 3 of James's longtime clients came by, shocked to hear what had happened to the man who had been in their homes and businesses for years. "This isn't right," said one of them, a retired teacher. "They can't just take someone because they fit a description. What kind of description is that?" Lisa's brother pulled up in his truck around 8 p.m. He'd driven 2 hours after getting her call. "Any word from Mike?" he asked as soon as he stepped through the door. Lisa shook her head. "He texted that he was at the station, but they're making him wait. He's trying to see James." "We should be down there," her brother said firmly. "All of us. They need to know they can't do this." By 9 p.m., a plan had formed. The kids would stay with Mrs. Thompson, and a group would go to the police station, not just family, but neighbors and community members too. Pastor Williams made some calls, and a local community organizer who handled civil rights issues promised to meet them there. "We're not going to cause trouble," Pastor Williams assured everyone. "But they need to see that James has people who care about him, who know he's not a criminal." Outside the police station, what started as a small group quickly grew. James's clients spoke with a local news reporter who happened to be at the station covering another story. The community organizer arrived with information about legal rights and a calm, strategic approach. "We need to request the body camera footage," she explained to Lisa and the pastor. "That will show exactly how they treated him during the arrest." Inside the station, Mike finally managed to meet with a police sergeant. He demanded information about what James was being charged with and why he'd been held for hours without formal charges. "My client was at his workplace all morning," Mike argued. "There's video evidence, multiple witnesses. What probable cause did your officers have to detain him?" The sergeant's uncomfortable shifting suggested the case might be on shakier ground than the arresting officers had indicated. Outside, the crowd had grown to about 30 people, not just family and close friends, but clients who trusted James in their homes, neighbors who had known him for years, church members who valued his contributions to the community. They weren't shouting or causing a disturbance, but their quiet, determined presence was impossible to ignore. A local news van pulled up, and suddenly the story of an electrician who had been arrested while on the job was becoming more visible. A reporter approached Lisa for a statement. "My husband is an honest businessman who was doing his job today," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "He's never been in trouble with the law. He was taken away in handcuffs for no reason except that he fit a description. We want answers, and we want him released immediately." Inside the station, the sergeant was making phone calls, looking increasingly concerned about the situation developing outside. James had lost track of time in the holding cell when the door finally swung open. A different officer stood there, his expression unreadable. "You're being released," he said flatly. James blinked in disbelief. "Just like that?" "Just like that," the officer confirmed, gesturing for James to follow him. In a processing room, James's belongings were returned to him, his wallet, phone, keys, and watch. As he slipped his wedding ring back on, he saw his phone had dozens of missed calls and messages. It was nearly midnight. He'd been held for almost 12 hours. Walking into the police station lobby felt like stepping into another world. The first person he saw was Mike, the attorney from his church, who looked tired but relieved. Then he spotted Lisa rushing toward him, and behind her, a surprising number of familiar faces, neighbors, clients, and friends. "What is all this?" James asked as Lisa threw her arms around him. "They weren't giving us any answers," she explained, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "So we brought some backup." Outside the station, James was stunned to see even more people, at least 30, some holding handmade signs saying "Free James" and "Electrical work is not a crime." A news van was parked across the street, a reporter doing a live stand-up. "They arrested another guy about an hour ago," Mike explained as they walked to his car. "Actual evidence this time. Security footage from the break-in clearly shows someone who looks nothing like you. They couldn't keep holding you after that." James sat in the backseat with Lisa, feeling drained. "I still don't understand why they took me in the first place." "Because you were a black man in your 30s in the general area," Mike said bluntly. "That's it. That was their probable cause. And that's why we're not letting this go." Over the next few days, as James tried to get back to his normal life, Mike and a civil rights attorney named Diane worked to build a case. The store's security footage proved James had been working continuously during the time of the break-in. The body camera footage from the arresting officers showed they had dismissed the store owner's attempts to verify James's identity without reasonable cause. "They'd violated your Fourth Amendment rights," Diane explained during a meeting at James's kitchen table. "You were detained without probable cause." They had no warrant. They'd ignored exculpatory evidence at the scene. James listened, still processing everything that had happened. "What does that mean for the officers?" "That's what we're going to find out," Diane said firmly. "This isn't just about you anymore. Your case is highlighting a pattern." Local media had picked up the story. A reporter had uncovered complaints against the same officers from other black men who had been stopped or detained on similarly vague descriptions. What started as James's personal nightmare was revealing a larger issue in the department. James's family felt the effects too. His children had nightmares. His 10-year-old came home from school upset after classmates asked why his dad had been arrested. Lisa took time off work to handle the sudden influx of meetings and interviews. But there was unexpected support as well. James's phone rang constantly with new work opportunities as people in the community deliberately sought out his electrical services. A local business organization issued a statement condemning the police actions and standing behind James's reputation. 2 weeks after the arrest, Diane filed a formal complaint with the police department and a civil lawsuit against the city. The department initially responded with a standard statement about officers acting in good faith based on information available at the time. But as evidence mounted and public pressure grew, cracks began to show in the official response. A city council member called for an independent review of the incident. The police chief agreed to meet with James and his attorneys. "I'm not doing this for money," James explained to a supportive client who asked about the lawsuit. "I'm doing it because next time, it could be my son they stop for no reason. Something has to change." The day before the scheduled meeting with the police chief, the local news broke a story that the department's own internal investigation had found procedural violations in James's arrest. Body camera footage that had initially been described as unavailable had been located, showing one officer acknowledging to another that the description they were working with was pretty thin. James watched the news report with Lisa, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," he said quietly. "But we've got a long way to go." 3 months after his wrongful arrest, James sat at a conference table in City Hall, facing the police chief and 2 city attorneys. His own lawyers, Mike and Diane, sat on either side of him. The mood in the room was tense but respectful. "We've reviewed all the evidence," the police chief said, his hands folded on the table. "And we acknowledge that the officers involved did not follow proper procedures during your detention." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was more than James had expected. The internal investigation had found that the officers had acted on an extremely vague description, ignored relevant evidence at the scene, and failed to document their reasoning properly. "Acknowledging the problem is just the first step," Diane responded. "We're here to discuss concrete changes to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, the city had agreed to a settlement that included not just compensation for James's lost work time and emotional distress, but also commitments to change departmental policies. Walking out of City Hall into the bright afternoon sunlight, James felt a mix of emotions, relief that the case was resolved, but also a strange sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about him anymore. "What happens now?" he asked Diane as they descended the steps. "Now the real work begins," she replied. "They've agreed to the policy changes on paper, but we need to make sure they actually implement them." Over the next few weeks, James found himself becoming an unexpected community leader. He spoke at church groups and neighborhood meetings, sharing his story and explaining the new police policies that had resulted from his case. Officers would now need specific, detailed descriptions before detaining suspects. They would be required to consider exculpatory evidence at the scene. Additional training on implicit bias would be mandatory. James's business was thriving, with more clients than he could handle. He hired 2 assistants and began teaching them the electrical trade. His wife teased him about becoming a local celebrity, but they both knew the attention wasn't always comfortable. Not everyone supported him. Some people in town felt he was being too hard on the police, that he should have accepted what happened and moved on. He received a few angry messages and once found a nasty note on his van windshield. But for every negative reaction, there were dozens of positive ones. People stopped him in the grocery store to thank him for speaking up. Parents of young black men shared stories of their own fears and experiences. A retired police officer even approached him after a community meeting to say he was glad someone was pushing for these changes. 6 months after the settlement, James sat in on a training session for police officers about the new procedures. The experience was surreal, watching officers learning from his case, seeing his own story used as an example of what not to do. One young officer approached him during a break. I just wanted to say, he said awkwardly, what happened to you wasn't right. I joined the force to protect people, not to make them afraid of us. The conversation stayed with James for days afterward. Change was happening, slowly but surely. A year after his arrest, James founded a community advocacy group called Fair Policing Initiative. The group brought together community members, civil rights attorneys, and reform-minded police officers to review cases, suggest policy improvements, and provide support to families dealing with similar situations. At the group's first public meeting, the room was packed. James stood at the front, still uncomfortable with public speaking, but determined to make a difference. What happened to me could have been the end of the story, he told the crowd. I could have taken the settlement money and tried to forget about it, but that wouldn't have changed anything. We're not here to attack the police. We're here to make policing better for everyone, including the good officers who want to serve their communities the right way. As he looked out at the faces in the audience, people of different ages, races, and backgrounds, James felt something he hadn't expected: hope. His wrongful arrest had been one of the worst experiences of his life, but it had led to connections and changes that might not have happened otherwise. We've got a long road ahead, he concluded, but we're not walking it alone.